The mad thing with it, Matt, is that you would love to have been an 18-year-old in Birmingham that week, because it's a city, it's close to my heart, really close to my heart. And I've never seen that city. And back then, of course, it was ugly. This is a lovely city now compared to then, but back then it was still full of the disasters of the 50s and the 60s, all those underpasses and stuff. And most of the buildings have been raised, and it's a great place now. It's a brilliant place to live, a brilliant place to visit. But that week, that city was the centre, not just of the boxing universe. It felt like it was the centre of the universe. I've never seen so many people inside the city. It was swollen. It was swollen to its limit. That's the best way I could possibly describe it. It was properly going off in Birmingham that week.
Okay, so let's just trace things back, because, as I said, the beauty of this fight and the beauty of most of the great fights that we've seen down the years in boxing are that they are based upon a rivalry. And the backstory for both of these two fighters is very interesting. Steve will be more familiar with it because he was there than myself. But you look at somebody like Benn. What interests me about these two is that their route towards the pros and their profile in their early days was completely different, because Benn had gathered a big reputation as an amateur fighter. He won the ABAs. He turned pro to quite a fanfare. There was backing, and there was celebrity, and there was some money there from the beginning, and people knew who he was. And with Eubank, it was different, because he went over to America after a kind of troubled, to say the least, formative period in his life over here. Learned to box in the South Bronx, which was extremely tough for him. And when he came back over here, nobody cared about him. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody was bothered. He arranged meetings with major promoters, and it took a long time for him to really get any kind of backing at all. And he would have been looking at Benn from a distance, thinking that everything that Benn had was what Eubank was kind of aiming to get. And I think it's fair to say, Steve, that Eubank had Benn in his crosshairs from quite a long way out, and that was the fight that he felt that he needed to get to make his name. So for him, this was a long time in the making.
Yeah, Eubank, once he'd come back and settled in Matchroom's gym in Romford, the old gym in Romford. Once he'd settled there, he was talking about fighting Nigel Benn, certainly in late '88. A year before Benn was to lose to Michael Watson. It was, Benn was the star. Benn was the guy he was gunning for. Benn was the guy he was aiming for. And I think what people sometimes do with Eubank is they make a mistake of remembering the monocled master later on, remembering the motorbikes, remembering all of the eccentricities, remembering the big fights, this fight with Benn, and then the rematch with Benn in front of 42,000 at the Theatre of Dreams, Old Trafford, the two fights with Steve Collins, then the two unbelievable clashes with Thompson. And they tend to forget those early years when he returned from America and how hard he was matched and how hard he had to work. And he transported himself all over the country to get extra sparring, and how hard he trained. He was genuinely the first in the gym and the last out at night. And that's because his living situation was poor. He had no money. And he worked and trained and pushed himself almost like no other fighter I've seen. Certainly, you don't see it now, because all the good fighters now, even the ones at the edges, they get looked after. But back then, I know it seems, I don't want to sound like an old man. You were 12, Matt was 8. So I guess that does make me an old man if I was there working. I don't want to sound like I'm living in the past, but the way Chris Eubank developed himself in the 2 years or so before this fight, it's nothing short of the way guys did it in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. We forget that. It's all revisionist history with Eubank, because in all fairness, he wants us to remember that, because he was still finding his feet, quite literally, Andy and Matt. He wasn't the Eubank we know. Sure, he was doing a little flip over the ropes, but the monocle hadn't come, the Harley Davidson hadn't come, the big truck hadn't come, the outrageous and outlandish statements hadn't come, because the big fights, the ultimate statement any boxer could make, they hadn't come. So that Eubank was working privately and not silently, don't get me wrong, but he was working behind the scenes. And I remember interviewing him in about 87 or 88, definitely early 88. And Benn was his man. At that point, Benn was knocking everybody out. That's the thing you missed out with Benn. There was all sorts of controversy attached to Benn. There was obviously the split with Frank Warren. But the bottom line is, I haven't got his record directly in front of me because I like to do shows like this without loads and loads of stats. But Benn was knocking everybody out. I mean, he was hitting people on the chin. They were going over. You go and look at a show reel of Benn. It's incredible. You know, sure, he was knocking over guys he was meant to knock over. So they were not only different fighters, they'd been plucked from different places and they were going down different routes. And there was a good chance Eubank was going to remain obscure. Don't get me, you know, there was no great machine behind Eubank. There was in the 6 months or so before the fight that we're going to talk about. But in the 2.5 years before then, you know, Barry was struggling to place him on his different shows, struggling to get him opponents, matching him quite hard. And even when he was winning, he was being booed. You know, I remember once he fought a guy called Ron Malik, a guy you could hit with just about every single piece of furniture in your house and you wouldn't dent Ron Malik. And Eubank smashed Ron Malik to bits. And I think he won on points, but he smashed him to bits. And they booed him. It was friendly boos, but they booed him. And he was kind of developing his character through shows like that. Whereas Benn was loved and adored, and he had a Porsche, which we've now found out he rented, and he had a fur coat, which we now found out was hired, and he did all those fantastic pictures, and we're never sure if the photographer got paid. You know the pictures. You know, him and Mendy, they were running riot. I mean, they were inventing footballers they were friends with. I mean, they were coming up with names of Argentinians and Brazilians who didn't exist. And it was literally their pal from the Greek restaurant in Ilford out for a night. So Mendy would send it out to the papers, and it would be like there'd be one footballer, like say John Fashioner would be there, and the 5 other guys, Mendy would just invent Argentinian or Brazilian names and call them Brazilian internationals. You know, Diego Maradona's protege. I mean, you can't invent the carnage that was created in the 6 months or so leading up to this fight. As I say, Matt, you would have loved every second. It was like, strap yourself in, because this is going to be a bumpy ride.
Well, Steve, you know what they say. You've got to fake it till you make it.
and that's the thing, because, you know, Mendy's a great entrepreneur, Ambrose Mendy, and Nigel Benn's a great fighter. So they were both really good at their business. It's just they like to add a little bit of extra onto it, you know. And what's wrong with that? And then once we got up to Birmingham, I mean, some of the statements are, you know, are like some of Donald Trump's last bleats. I mean, I can assure you, I mean, some of the stuff that was meant to have gone on that didn't go on, that's now established fact, and it's been written about and talked about, is just carnage. But that was just the backdrop. That was the backdrop to what we saw on the night.
Well, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
That's the truth.
Say it often enough, myth becomes fact.
That's one of the best things about this whole thing, is that there are so many brilliant stories, and for me, looking at it a few years removed, it's impossible for me to know which ones are true and which ones aren't. And maybe as we go along, Steve will be able to.
I'll do my best.
But Matt, just on Eubank, one thing that's always really interested me about him, and you can probably empathise with how hard this must have been because you've been there and done it yourself, is that when he moved over to New York, he was getting in trouble in London, basically, and he moved over to New York to live with his mum, and they're in the South Bronx, and he found his way to the gym and he started boxing, and he learned his trade basically over there in the gyms over there, in one gym in particular, and that must have been some schooling, because turning up in a gym unannounced anywhere in the world is difficult enough, but turning up in New York unannounced as somebody who isn't from there, it was probably quite awkward, who didn't sound like he was from there. I mean, you're going to grow up fast in those circumstances.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And the South Bronx is a tough part of New York. Look, you know, everyone sees, like you say, he's developed into his character and his persona now, and he, you know, he gives it the English gentleman one, doesn't he? But he is hard as nails and always was hard as nails. So him going over there, I'm sure he was nervous going in the gyms like anyone is when they go to a strange place. They don't know anybody and you're the outsider. But I'm pretty sure he would have earned his stripes early doors, because we know, and he went on to prove, he's a tough man.
You know, those fights he had in Atlantic City are really hard and difficult. And he was, you know, undercard fighter, but getting paid peanuts, having to pay a lot of people money, hard with travel. I think in the South Bronx, I think an irate father took some shots at him, fired some stuff at him. You know, so some of this might be true, some of this won't be true. But he certainly lived an edgy life out there, Eubank, before returning here. And I'll tell you what I have got, and you mentioned there about his persona, this English gentleman. I've got some, when I was working on the Michael Watson book about 15 years ago, I asked some people at ITV to provide if they had any footage, unused footage. And sure enough, I've got hours, I've still got it, hours and hours and hours of VHSs shot at the press conferences, both for the Michael Watson and Chris Eubank fight at White Hart Lane, Michael Watson and Nigel Benn. And I also got thrown in Chris Eubank against Nigel Benn. And it's just hours, and some of it's just a locked off camera. You know what I mean by that? It's a technical term. So you just see people walking in and out of vision. But a lot of it is shot backstage. And I've got this great stuff between Benn and Eubank on about the Friday. I'm not sure if the final press conference was a Thursday or a Friday, because the fight was on a Sunday night. So at the final press conference where they're backstage, and Benn has got his people around him, and Eubank's almost on his own. He's just got Ronnie Davis there. And Ronnie Davis looks a little bit nervous because Ben's got some people around him. He's got Pete DeFreitas, who's got, you know, things written on his knuckles left and right to help him in case he's ever got to turn left or right when he's driving. I love Peter to death, but that's the truth. And Ambrose is there, and there's some big old lumps. You know, 3 or 4 of Ben's friends, remember, were shot in that Range Rover, remember, in Essex. I mean, there's some serious lumps. And then suddenly, Eubank does a really interesting thing. He launches into patois. There's no English. It's pure street patois. And you see Benn caught off guard a little bit. And that was the Eubank, the shoplifter, the Eubank who was run out of Peckham when he was 16 or 17. And that was a moment. And the irony is, I didn't see that, Matt, I didn't see that for 25 years after the fight. But I knew that person was under there. I knew there was a steely, different character. But it's a really great glimpse at what was the real fight in Eubank. And he comes right back at them. He's in their face, and it's pure patois, and he's on edge, and he's glaring at them. And let me tell you, all those people that are with Benn, they're not too keen to get in Eubank's face at that particular point. I thought that was a great little tell. I've got that footage. You know what? I might have the only copy of it. I love it.
At what point, Steve, did he start to become the Eubank that we now know? Because I've always been fascinated by this in particular, because people will say, and I've heard a lot of people say, that is him, that was always him. It can't always have been him. I've read some other stuff that from some of your colleagues who said that when he first came back from America and you all first met him, he wasn't that person. There was a bit of an American accent going on there, as would be natural. But he's inhabited that character he made for himself so comprehensively. That is him now, but at some point it wasn't.
Yeah, he was looking for something. He was looking for some kind of different character. I wrote a piece in the Ring magazine, so I used to be their British correspondent, and I wrote the piece in about 1987, and I called him the misunderstood kid, because it was hard to shoehorn him, but he wanted to be something different. So it was almost like he was trying on outfits, literally, without trying on outfits. And so he settled on the sort of looking at you like that and looking at you sort of strange and choosing his words. He thought quite a lot about what he said, and he took a second to get it into his head. That's not strange. You know, Barry McGuigan was doing that as well. And lots of fighters do that now. In fact, they do it too much now because it just gets boring. But so he was thinking about what he said. And then little eccentricities came after that. A lot of those came with money, like the Harley Davidson, the cane, the monocle, and the clothing. That came with money, you know. But the just being different, and this stance that he had about how he was different. I'm not like you. And that led later on, post the first fight with Benn, to him being accused of all sorts of things. Mickey Duff famously called him a whore. And in fact, Mickey Duff nearly got thrown out of the press conference for calling Eubank a whore, saying you use boxing, you're just like a whore. You hate it. You make your money from it, but you say you hate it. Duff was an easy man to get on with, but he loved boxing. You couldn't doubt that. And he really questioned Eubank's commitment to the sport, which is a joke. Anyone that's ever seen Eubank train or fight knows that you can never question his commitment to the sport. So the character was developing slowly. So the Simply the Best came probably in about 1988. Darky Smith used to work alongside Eubank in the gym out at Romford. That was Darky's influence. He was a mad Tina Turner fan. So he got that late 87, early 88. And the jump over the ropes came around the same time. Of course, young Nassim, who was in the schoolboy finals at the time, was doing the same thing. And Eubank had watched Naz in the gym in Sheffield when they'd been up sparring with Errol Graham, where Errol Graham handled him very handily. Don't worry about that. Eubank has maybe reinvented that over the years. I saw some of those sessions. And then Eubank was just a kid coming up from London. So he was starting to pick up different bits and pieces. It wasn't an overnight thing. He didn't come out of his bedsit in Hove, I think, or living with Karen's parents in Hove. He didn't come out of there one day and suddenly come out fully formed. It was a little bit all along. By the time we get to this fight in November 90, he's got a lot of it there, apart from the stuff that only money can bring. And in fact, he has his music sabotaged on the way to the ring, which is such a spoof because Ambrose had said to everybody that wanted to listen, don't worry, Simply the Best, forget that, we'll get that cut. So you get about 20 seconds of Simply the Best and it gets whipped. And it sounds like it's whipped off a turntable. I mean, obviously it's not. Maybe it was. Maybe there's a geezer there with a record player. Because that's what it sounded like. It's a distinctive sound. Like if I turn you off now, you don't hear it. You're just gone. But if I pull a record off a turntable, and that's what it sounded like. It was nuts. So it sounded like someone had ripped off the one version, the one LP, the 12-inch version of Simply the Best that Eubank had been used in. I wonder if there is a 12-inch version of Simply the Best that Eubank carries with him. You know, modern fighters have a little CD or they ask people to go online. But I wonder if Chris Eubank travelled around with a 12-inch version of Simply the Best, which he gave to people at different venues, like, I don't know, the Festival Hall in Basildon. I mean, what a lovely idea. As I said to you, it's like something from the 40s, not something from the 90s.